So when I tell you how much of this stuff is arbitrary or will work regardless of what path you choose, I'm not saying it to be dismissive. I'm saying it to give you some freedom to just make a commitment so you can actually move forward. What's going on, guys? It's Bromley. I'm back. I know I've been gone for over a month. Oh my God, so much stuff has happened. We started celebrating Halloween in July. I competed at America's Strongest Man in San Antonio. We've been to Texas 3 times.
The beige building over here on the right, that's the Mocara Hotel now, but it used to be the home of the Frank cattle.
Me and my wife got a house. We're in escrow and are moving there next month. And I realized amidst all of this stress, I am horrible at multitasking. Also, one of the big reasons I haven't been producing is because I really wanted to finish this book. Superior Deadlift is coming out in 5 days. I have it getting formatted right now. It will be on the Kindle store. It will be on my store. If you want to get it first and free, go ahead and join up for my Patreon. All tiers get every ebook, every digital publication I make absolutely for free, and they get it before everybody else. That is my consolation prize to them for dealing with my very inconsistent production schedule. It's kind of like when a deadbeat dad buys his kid ice cream instead of actually showing up to the parent-teacher conference. I'm actually really proud of this one. Every publication I make is slowly starting to look more like a book and less like a 100-page blog post. So I'm a little proud of that. So be sure to keep those eyeballs peeled. What's going on, guys? It's Bromley coming to you from my living room. This is where the magic happens. This is where all of the great ideas get turned into content for you to digest and pick apart and apply to your own training. I made a few videos recently where I was critical of some YouTube personalities for the types of methods they use to present themselves to their audience that was really good for establishing authority and getting clicks and attention, but in my opinion is very backwards for what new lifters need to be focusing on if they want to see consistent progress. To summarize, there's literally no scenario where somebody is better off for trying to parse through academic studies as opposed to just picking up Arnold's bodybuilding encyclopedia and going to town. So now when I made those videos, I was critical, and it's easy to be a critic. In fact, nowadays everybody's a critic because it comes at no cost. And the funny thing is, everybody's superpower is calling things problematic, but very, very few people actually commit to a policy or a solution or something to replace their critique with. And the reason for that is simple. When you actually draw a line in the sand, you give away your coordinates, somebody's gonna come along and sink your battleship. By committing to an actual policy, you then hold yourself accountable when shit goes sideways. But that's what I'm trying to do here. It's not enough for me to criticize these guys. I wanna replace it with what I think is actually a better approach. These videos got me thinking about what the right questions are. It's not just with the limitations of the studies. It's not just that they're flawed or they're not done well or they're inconclusive or that it takes you back to the same point you started with because it's always finished with the statement, the results are individual, you have to find what works for you, which is counter to every single other scientific discipline. It's like, okay, well, we knew that to begin with, so how did the study help us? The real big beef I have with the academic approach is that it teaches people to ask the wrong questions. They start to think in terms of a binary because that's what studies are. It's comparing this group with that group. You're trying to isolate results to a 1 or a 0, a yes or a no. The way that lifters need to be thinking is about how they can make meaningful changes to what they're doing now to elicit a desired result. People become conditioned to think in terms of best. What is a better rep range? What is a better exercise? What is a better split? They are all meaningless. It doesn't matter what you start with. Remember, we're adaptive organisms. We experience a stress, and it can be any stress. It doesn't matter what the exercise is. It doesn't matter what the split is. It doesn't matter what the rep range is. If you take those stressors and you increase them over time, if you progress them forward, you adapt to that. Please pay attention to this point because this is what I have to repeat to all of my clients. And this is probably the most important nugget of truth when it comes to long-term training success. This will save you hundreds of hours of stress. You ready? We're gonna zoom in nice and tight. We're gonna write this down. You're gonna tattoo it on your forehead in reverse so you can see it in the mirror every morning when you brush your teeth. It is not the mode of stress that causes spectacular growth. It is the mode of progression. Whatever you start with doesn't matter. I can write a program where somebody trains once a week and grows. I can write a program where somebody pulls 2 a day, 6 days a week and grows. They all have their own different set of rules for how to optimize it, but they all work if and only if you progress the stress forward over time and if it's sustainable enough that they don't overtrain. So in a lot of these videos, you've heard me talk about the dials you can turn, these different training variables. Anytime you turn one dial, all of the others have to turn. And the way that they have to turn in order to accommodate to get a good result is known by anybody who's been in the field for a while, and they don't really have the ability to control for that in the study. So these are all the dials, these are all the gears, and that's how I want you to think about it, because turning one will and should result in the turning of all the others in some specific way. The reason that training is so complicated is because there are so many damn ways to grow that we end up getting paralyzed by all of the options. And I'm sure you've all experienced this. You sat down trying to write out a program and you were immediately faced with an option, and it was probably an arbitrary one.
Well, should I do 8s for this exercises or 12s?
Then you sit there with a pen to your mouth thinking,
8s or 12s? I need more information.
So before you've even gotten the skeleton of your structure or looked at what the long-term deadline is going to be, you're already just up against a wall where you have no room to move because these endless options are crippling. So when I tell you how much of this stuff is arbitrary or will work regardless of what path you choose, I'm not saying it to be dismissive. I'm saying it to give you some freedom to just make a commitment so you can actually move forward. All right, so let's start with the meat and potatoes, why we adapt anyways, how this whole process works. Well, this is the SRA curve, stress recovery adaptation. Basically, this just means we incur a particular stress. The result is that our capacities, our abilities are temporarily hindered. After you do a heavy workout, you're depleted, you're fatigued, you can't perform at the same level, and that might persist for as long as it takes your body to kind of get its house back in order. Ideally, we would think about stacking these SRA curves on top of each other. Now, I want you to imagine that this is the exact same workout. This is somebody who's new to training. It's the exact same weight, sets, reps. You're going to notice that you're going to get a little better each time until you stop adapting to that work, and that's where you're going to level out. Now, this is a sigmoidal curve, this little S curve up here. It shows exponential growth in the beginning. We can call that newbie gains, and then eventually diminish returns set in and you level out. Now, that's for essentially the same workload every day or every session. Now imagine that we tweak it. We know stress has to move forward. So imagine our workouts are actually getting harder. Well, if we're not just doing the same amount of work, if stress is increasing, we can only accommodate that increase if we continue to adapt. Eventually, that same stress increase is going to lead to diminished return. Now, if we get caught in a very specific trap where stress keeps going up and we're not adapting, what happens is recovery is hindered. If you can't recover, but stress keeps going up, you're left a little worse for wear every time. And this is where the workouts leave you feeling like you got rode hard and left out wet. So this is obviously undesirable, right? We want to avoid this point of not just overtraining, we want to avoid this point of stagnation to begin with. And that's one of the reasons I don't like when linear progressions get to the point where you're just trying to live and die for those 5-pound jumps, because at that point, you're already starting to get stagnant. You're better off changing the stimulus. All right, beautiful. So we expose ourselves to stress, we recover, we adapt, and we just continue doing that on into the future, and this time next year we'll be ready to book our trip to Worlds, right? Eventually the amount of stress you're doing is, one, not providing a new adaptation because you already adapted to it, or two, as you get stronger, you actually require more time to recover. So this same time frame doesn't work, and you need to take that recovery out a little bit longer. Scheduling workouts is easy. Anybody can go in and work hard for an hour. The meat and potatoes of your program is how you manage recovery to make that stress sustainable. Now, we have a lot of ways of doing that, and you probably know some of them already. If you're starting with linear progression, if you're working in the practical programming universe, you're doing those 5-pound jumps on your 3x5 every few days. As you get intermediate, eventually you take it out to every week, something like the Texas method. It's every week. Then they have bi-weekly, then they have 3-week waves, and eventually you're in something that looks like block periodization where it's every 12 or 16 weeks. Another way of doing it, if you're running these linear progressions, is just when you reset. You don't get to the point where you regress, you get to the point where you're in the weeds up here and you're feeling stagnant. If you restart the program, that takes you all the way back to the beginning. That counts as a big period of recovery. It allows you to get that momentum. Deloads are another common way. If you're on a linearly periodized scheme, maybe you're going from 10s to 8s to 6s over 16 weeks all the way up to singles. Well, every 3 or 4 weeks, you might take a week where you just clear out, and then that allows you to pick up where you left off. You can have more of your workouts be substantial. You don't have to worry about walking that line of recovery, because every 3 or 4 weeks, you can look forward to that period where your body catches up. But remember, again, this goes back to the golden rule. As long as stress is going up over time and you're recovering enough to allow yourself to catch up, you are going to grow. It doesn't matter what the exact mode of training is. So that brings us to these training variables. And there's probably more than these. These are just the ones that stood out. your organization, like what split you're running, what exercise you do together, how frequently are you doing the main lifts, the exercise selection itself, which lifts you pick, what percentage of them are accessories. Are you doing a lot of accessory work, or is it mainly just the barbell work? Are you doing a lot of variations? Which exercises compete? Doing a squat only split is a lot different than if you're trying to develop your squat and deadlift at the same time. Effort, this is a big one. This is one of my favorite training variables to manipulate because it's the easiest. I'm a big fan of low effort work, meaning low RPE, staying way away from failure. It's better for technical development. It's better for widening out your base. It's easier to recover from. It's easier to progress volume forward. It answers a lot of questions, checks a lot of boxes. But when you do that for a while, one of the easiest changes you can make is to start to reincorporate effort. That either means high percentage work or it means actually doing AMRAPs. That is a very easy change to make that is very, very productive. The total amount of work you're doing, most of us just call that volume. That can be higher reps, that can be more total reps, that can be more working sets. There's a lot of ways to measure the total amount of work. It can be actual tonnage. You can add it up and figure out mathematically how much you're working. And then there's the threshold. The rep range. Working 1s, 2s, and 3s is a lot different than working 10s and 12s. Works your energy systems differently. The adaptations are subtly different, even though they can all kind of carry over to each other in the long term. So I want to lay all of these out so that you can think about how you are going to change your training long term. Don't get overwhelmed. Remember, this should be liberating that there are so many productive ways to change your training. It shouldn't be suffocating. People look at this, they panic because they're like, oh my God, there's so many changes. Remember, these are all viable. You just have to commit to one or two, make sure you implement it, and then make sure you take notes so you can see moving forward. I'd like to take 15 seconds to say that if you found any of this helpful or insightful, do me a solid, go ahead and subscribe, hit the notification bell, and consider joining Patreon or our Facebook group, Base Strength. Also, do consider checking out Base Strength and Peak Strength. Those two books do the best to summarize my entire training philosophy so you don't have to sift through 80 videos to get a grasp on exactly how I think training should go. It's all consolidated there. Keep an eye out for Superior Deadlift. That's going to be coming out very, very soon. Thanks for watching, everybody. I appreciate your support. So if you remember going back over training organization, we have microcycles. That's like the work week, right? And then so many of those, usually 4, 5, or 6 weeks makes up a mesocycle. Those are kind of blocks, chunks of training. That's how I want you to think about your training. You should pick a threshold, a set organization, get your exercise laid out, understand how much effort you're going to be applying on each working set, and understand how much total amount of work you're going to be doing. And you should progress that in some way over a 4, 5, 6 week block, and then look to change something. So this is where I use my driving into the mud analogy. Imagine you're in a truck and you're on hard pavement. You got a lot of purchase. You're building up a lot of speed. As you get to the dirt, it gets a little harder to maintain speed, but you got that momentum carrying you forward. And then you see this big mud pit, and you just take it as deep into that mud pit as you can. But how far you get is determined by how much momentum you built up when the tires were on hard, firm pavement. And when you get stuck in the mud, the tires start spinning. What do? You back up onto that hard pavement, reestablish that foundation, build up momentum, and every time you punch through a little bit farther. That's exactly how this works. The easy weeks, the first week of establishing your baseline, getting comfortable with all this organization and all this stuff, that's where everything should be easy and crisp and you should have a handle on it. And then you start to progress as the weeks go on, and that momentum allows you to reach those last few weeks right before things would ultimately tail off. And that is where you implement your changes. So the types of changes I want you to think about, and it's very important that you understand, none of this is new. This is really just how I conceptualize what periodization has been doing all along. So any of you who've read my books, you know the base and peak dynamic. It's really just a different way of conceptualizing things like kind of volume, hypertrophy, accumulation phases. That's essentially your base, versus more strength, intensification, more specific contest prep phases. That's your peak. So the example goes like this. I'll reiterate again because it bears as much repeating as I can. Imagine this little pyramid here. This represents your potential ability to do something. Your base, the bottom of it, is built up of these constituent elements, and you can do this for anything, for studying for an exam or learning a new skill. All of these non-specific qualities all come together to determine how potentially good you're going to be at this one particular activity. We can look at psychology. Let's just take me squatting, a young Bromley squatting back in the day. I used to hate squatting because my psychology sucked. I hate being crushed by the heavy weight, and I would whiff on a lot of sets. I got a lot of PRs just by getting my psychology straightened out. Being able to be more intense and aggressive. Capacity, did I even have the endurance to be able to train hard enough to grow to begin with? Imbalances, how well-rounded was I? Did I have lagging muscle groups? Was I bound? Was I having a hard time getting into position? The best performance, the best possible performance comes from the most efficient machine. If you're not balanced, you're not going to be efficient. Technique, efficiency, how precise are you? How confident are you? How similar are your attempts when the weight gets heavy? Mass is probably the biggest one. That's the one that is the most trainable and the one that for some reason nowadays people overlook the most. But mass is important. You're not going to accidentally become a 300-pound bodybuilder. It takes a lot of time and focus to add a couple pounds of muscle tissue. So take it seriously. The more mass you have, the more potential you have to move weight. That's very important. So if I take this base and I just scale it out and make this pyramid bigger, notice that I got better at all these things. My potential for performance increased dramatically. That's what base building is. We are increasing our potential for performance by taking all of this stuff and emphasizing it. Now, this is the backbone of all athletic training. We do the most broadest, varied work. We take care of these smaller constituent components very far out from actual game day. So if we're 8 months away from the competitive season, we don't have to actually do a lot of specific work. We can focus on these small things. Work is varied, it's broad. Again, targeting weaknesses, building a wide foundation. As you get closer to the competitive season, that's what the peak phase is. Again, football players, volleyball players, and lifters do all this. Now we're focused on chasing that peak, actually turning that potential into a realized event. You might even experience when your base gets really wide, you might experience, hey, I'm bigger. I know I've seen improvements at these rep ranges and with these exercises, and you might be underwhelmed if you try to pull off a 1 rep max attempt right off the bat. It takes time to realize that potential, and that's why you go through a full peak phase. That's why if you're running programs, they'll take you going from 10s to spending time in 5s and 6s before you get to singles, doubles, and triples. There's a reason everything moves in that direction is because this all builds off each other. This is specific development to make that potential reality. More specific work. We're getting our nervous system coordinated for strength. We're learning to recruit more motor units and to do so faster. We're learning to do it with specific technical setup. Technique with singles and doubles is different than with 10s and 15s. It's a reason Olympic lifting varies between the sport and like CrossFit, because the energy systems are different and it merits different techniques. They are not the same event. Energy systems are different. Recovery, that's the big thing right there. Recovery, as you get rid of the varied fluff, you get rid of the things that aren't going to help you directly on game day. That allows more recovery. So as you're straining under these heavier loads, you're benefiting from more recovery so that you get this huge upswing in performance because you have more resources available to grow. Remember the saying, I hear from Israel all the time, fatigue masks fitness? It's true. When you're base building, fatigue is very high. When you're in an accumulation or hypertrophy or volume phase, you're doing a ton of work, fatigue's high. You are doing too much work to actually be recovered. If you're recovered enough to perform 100%, you're not training hard enough to actually grow. So this is where we actually let that recovery catch up, and that's where you see that big upswing. So again, more specific, greater efforts, greater recovery, and that's where we start to get closer and closer to what performance game day is going to look like. Now, this is huge that you guys understand this. This is not just for competitive lifters. In fact, that's the reason I made it 2 phases instead of the 3, 4, 5, 6 that you see, depending on what author you're reading. There are plenty of people who have gone crazy with having all of these different definitions for shock and transition phases and hyper-specific types of phases. And there's no reason for you to understand all that. This is broad. This is a broad principle you need to keep track of so that when you spend so much time doing one thing, you know it's time to transition. All right, so we covered what our base phase looks like. Varied movements, more volume, more fatigue, getting weaknesses rounded out, widening out that base to raise our potential. And then our peak phase, which is where we're going to chase that potential. And that has to be present in everybody's program long term in one way or another if you want continued growth. This addresses the problems with the SRA curve that we ran into. This will address the problems of stagnation. It will expose you to new novel stresses that you are now sensitive to. It will allow you to recover, to avoid falling off the cliff over here when you begin to overtrain. This is what is required, this ebb and flow. And like I said, it is what is mirrored in all periodized templates in all athletic programming. You don't need to compete, but if you're a recreational lifter and you want to continue to grow, you have to follow some model like this. So this is where we can look at these training variables and we can start to analyze how they're put together in whatever template or program you're running so we can make good decisions about how we should change these from training block to training block. If you spend a lot of time doing something like power building, where you're doing heavy compound movements, but you're also doing a lot of sets, a lot of reps. The guys in the 70s used to live and die by this, and it flies in the face of what a lot of people think strength-specific training should be. When you see these 70s era power builders, guys like Doug Young and Kazmaier and Ted Arcidi, and guys that just did a lot of work, it was a lot of repeating sets of 10, 12, and more with compound movements. One of my favorite things to do is to volumize that out when people need to add mass quickly, where you start with a few sets of 10 and then you go 4 or 5 sets. Eventually you're doing many repeating sets of 10 to 12 reps over a lot of exercise. By the time you adapt to it, trust me when I say you grow. Well, that makes you sensitive to these lower rep ranges. So you can change the threshold, move into 5s and 6s, make your exercise selection more specific. You can move to a program where the frequency is a little bit different. If you're doing a lot of volume for each exercise, 1 day per week, and you do that for many training blocks, eventually if you move to a higher frequency split, you're going to be sensitive to that. And that's going to be an increase in specificity. So these are the types of things we need to concern ourselves. And this is the important stuff with programming. Again, you have to learn to ask the right questions. It's not that any one program is going to be better or worse, because they're all going to hit you differently depending on what you did before, what you are already adapted to. So at all times, when you're thinking about what should my training be, it needs to take into account where your abilities are now, where you're weak. Do you need to widen your base out? Do you need to spend more time doing the things you don't like to do that are a little more varied and take a lot more work? Or are you due to actually dig in and get some more specific work to limit your exercise selection and handle some harder efforts? Now, this can happen on a variety of timelines. I talked about doing mesocycle to mesocycle 4, 5, 6 weeks at a time and then switching over. Basically how these periodized contest preps are laid out, they might go 10 or 12 weeks. You can also do it over a much longer timeline. I like to do months of volumizing at a time when I'm really trying to grow, and I've had clients do that as well. If you need more mass, and you are a relatively undeveloped lifter, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do very, very specific work until you've gotten a reasonable amount of mass on your frame. So you can spend a lot more time getting that base rounded out before you actually commit to doing very specific powerlifting style work. But the thing is, most of you, just about everybody watching this, is going to be between the novice and intermediate range. And if you want to be very competitive, you need to make some quantum leaps. And that means taking care of your base. Most of you need to be prioritizing base work, and only when this gets stale do you start to focus on this. Now, this is what everybody loves doing. Everybody loves starting with the specialized stuff and doing high frequency programs or lifting as heavy as they can or limiting everything to the same few barbell movements. As fun as it is, this is what very few of you actually need. Most of you need the variety of exercise, the sets of 10s and 12s. Honestly, most of you I would tell just to go get Arnold's Bodybuilding Encyclopedia and start going to work. Get back to me in 6 months after doing that with a high calorie diet.